Okay, he says, my longest ride to date is 63 miles. I just completed a 50-mile route where I averaged 185 watts with a weighted average of nearly 200 watts. A couple of questions. Yeah, solid, right? So a couple of questions. How much under your FTP is considered a good endurance number for me to ride during long periods of time? And he says, what will I need for a full 100? So kind of like a basic question that he has on pacing right there. And really, it kind of comes down to time, right? It's not just the distance that you've done, but also the time. That would be like the key thing on this for sure. Nate or Amber, what would you kind of like ballpark for on something like this? What would you like, or how do you pace things for something like a longer event like this?
I'll go first. If it's a group ride, if you're not by yourself, then totally I'm going to be in groups. I'm probably going to put out way more effort on the hills to stay with the group, and I'll be looking for people that on the climbs, like I can kind of stay with them, and then in a group effort, that makes it a lot easier, and that'll be a faster overall time. If I'm by myself, Ironman would be different than my road bike, but road bike I'd probably be around 0.7 to 0.75 IF, somewhere in there. That would be probably pretty. That would be hard though, 0.75 I bet.
Yeah, it's a friendly spot to put yourself though for something like this, relatively speaking. Once again, Jesse's post about how to build a pacing plan for long events, he talks about like this very thing in there and has like, you know, some specifics that he recommends or that we've seen basically from some data.
Amber, what about you?
Yeah, how would you do it? Because you've helped so many people, like you've gone to these like camps and done a lot of this stuff and ridden with a lot of people that are probably in a similar scenario, I would assume.
Oh yeah, I would echo a lot of almost everything that Nate said. So the first thing I would do is try to find a group that's going a pace that feels good to me and stick with them because you have the benefit of the draft. The social component's really awesome. And then if you find yourself in a group that's going too fast for you, you can always drop back to a group behind you until you find a group that feels like they're at an effort level that feels appropriate for you. And then if you're by yourself, yeah, I think, what was it, 0.7 IF you were saying? I think that's about right. Which is kind of hard, like unless you've really trained that sort of rate of perceived exertion, that might be a hard thing. But I mean, you kind of have a good idea of what feels sustainable. So I would, you know, most of these events there are other people around you. So it's probably unlikely that you'll be alone for very long. Someone will catch up to you or you'll pass somebody. And so yeah, during the times where you are alone, just find a pace that feels sustainable.
Have you guys ever done a longer race where then you get in no man's land or no woman's land, no athlete's land, and you're riding by yourself for like an hour, and then a group catches you and they're going a little bit faster than you, and you're like, I could have waited and been with them and like saved so much, so much, like all the time, right? Because you look behind and you don't see a group and you don't know if it's because some of the longer races, even if there are 2,000 people. Like it gets pretty few and far between when you're 6-7 hours. Like Leadville was an example. There wasn't a group coming, but anyway, that's
yeah, for sure. That's happened. I think to all of us listening to this, where we think that we're alone and we think we're the last rider on course, or at least we ride like it, right? And we're definitely not. And one thing in this. Yeah, go ahead, Amber. Sorry.
I was just going to say, chances are you're not the last rider on course. And I can't think of anybody who would regret sitting up and waiting for a group and then riding with a group. I mean, it's just, you really can't go wrong with that move, honestly.
I think too, especially if it's windy, if you I'm thinking about Dirty Kansas where you might have 5 hours left. I think if you wait for one person and then you can have two people working together, you can both go so much faster. And if it's a really long event, you can stop and like refuel, rehydrate, right? Especially if you do it at an aid station, just wait for somebody else to come.
Yeah.
I doubt you're waiting 30 minutes. I bet you're waiting 3 minutes.
Yeah.
I realized that we were using IF and intensity factor without describing really what it is. So people may like have a question about what that is. Nate, do you want to, I guess, throw out what your definition would be for intensity factor?
It's just percent of FTP. So 0.75 would be 75% of your FTP.
Yeah, so it's since Trey has a power meter, it's pretty easy to figure out what that number would be, and that's kind of like a good, like that 0.7 to 0.75, however you want to do that. That would be a good ballpark to think like, okay, well, if I am on my own, this sort of pace is probably okay if you're truly on your own. But chances are you can ride with somebody else and do even lower than that and probably get a faster time. Speaking of this is like all of us probably, we all definitely did. We had that time when we went out and rode 100 miles for the first time. And mine My experience is pretty embarrassing, but I figured we should all share what we did going through that experience for like all of us. Chad, do you remember the first time you rode something like a century or 100 miles? And what was it like?
Yeah, the closest we were training, it was, I can't even remember, 1990 something. And we were doing the MS 150, which is 150 miles, but it's broken over 2 days. And so that means basically 75 miles per day. And the longest ride we had done was to Carson City, Reno, and back. So I think it came out to be a 60-mile day, which was a big deal. Mm-hmm. And it actually set us up really nicely. It showed us that just a small decrement in what we thought we could do, just enough of a drop in pace to make it slightly less uncomfortable, maybe even bordering uncomfortable, made the 275-mile days that came later actually very doable.
Yeah.
That's not 100 miles.
No, I know. No, you're absolutely right. But I do think that both of those we could have dragged out from 75 to 100 miles. It wouldn't have been pleasant, but we certainly could have done it physically.
I was terrible on my first one. It was a really hard ride. It's called the Death Ride, and it was like 115 miles with a ton of climbing.
It's a little different.
Oh yeah, but it was
tons of climbing.
It was like it was like 15,000 feet. But it was my first 100 miles. Very poor choice. I could have done many other options for that, and it was terrible. I was eating first of all, I wasn't eating, and then suddenly I was like, I think I'm nearly on death's door, so I need to eat. So then I just grabbed like a bunch of like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and like pretzels and stuff, and then felt like death. At one point, I just like fell over on the last climb. Like I was an absolute mess. So like anybody listening to this that thinks that people like breeze into things, I definitely wasn't there. I did not breeze into it at all.
That's 4,500 meters. The Death Ride for climbing over 150 miles. I don't know, I'm sure what that is, but you guys can do that math in your head.
It's a lot.
It was too much for me. That's what it was then. Amber,
I did it on.
Nate, go ahead. Yeah, Amber first, then Nate.
I don't remember the first time that I did 100 miles, but I will say that, so one of the things that we used to do when I was racing professionally was at the end of the season, we'd go and do some of the fun fall fondos, and those would often be somewhere around 100 miles. And they're super, super fun, but it was hilarious because we'd be at the end of the season. So we'd have almost peak fitness, right? And we'd go and we would do these fondos for fun, and they would destroy us. Seriously, but we were getting destroyed not because we were we were pushing the pace per se, but it was just because we were stopping at all the aid stations, because a lot of these fondos have really, really good food at the aid stations. So we're like eating fluffernutters, hanging out, having a couple Cokes, and we're standing around for 15, 20 minutes because it's, there's beautiful scenery and you chatting with people and having a good time, and then you get back on the bike again. The next thing you know, by the end of the day, you're just a walking shell of a human being. If you can walk, actually. So one of the things I found with these actually is to be really mindful of how frequently you're stopping and for how long. So trying to minimize the number of stops and minimizing the length of time that you're stopping. That said, you still want to be fueling really well. And one of the things that's really easy to do on a long ride like that is to lull yourself into this complacent sense of like, I feel fine, until suddenly you don't feel fine. So you want to be making sure that you're fueling and hydrating early and often before you think that you need it. And that could be really easy to forget to do. So even setting like a little alarm reminder either on your phone or your cycling computer every 30 minutes so that you're taking something in every 30 minutes on a really consistent basis, because when you need it, it's going to be too late if you haven't already been taking that in consistently. So I would throw that out there as well. And then to what we were discussing earlier about finding a good group, if you get in a group where it's going too hard, don't worry about pulling the plug on that group and dropping back to find another group. Janelle Spilker has this really great, I don't have all of them right here, but she has this whole list that she calls phrases for friends, which are all of the socially acceptable ways that you can tell people that you don't want to ride with them because they're going too fast for you. But one of them that I do remember is just, this is a bit rich for my blood. I'm going to drop back a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that. And if you do find yourself kind of going far harder than you want to, back it off and take some recovery time, because this is, 100 miles is a really long time. So if you go a little too hard on one climb, you got plenty of time to just back it off, take in some food, hydrate, and recover from that before you kind of bring it back up to a steady state pace again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super important. Don't try to ride with fast people at the beginning. If it feels hard at the beginning, that's bad.
That's bad. Sure. That's going to be a bad time. Yeah.
Yeah. Nate, how about you?
I was training for an Ironman, so I did it on a TT bike, and I rode up from South Reno to Red Rock in California and back, and it was horrible. It was really bad. Everything hurt, and I said, no way am I going to be able to run a marathon after this. And you know what? I didn't. I walked a marathon. So that was exactly right.
There.
Do you think you could have done anything different to make it less horrible?
Like tons. I think I was eating like a gel an hour, eating McDonald's 3 times a day, like just everything bad. I was 27 or 28, and it was, I did nothing optimal at all. So yeah, everything could be better. And I got gator skins on. It was really bad.
Hey, did you get any flats though?
No flats.
There we go. Gator skins right there. So his second part of his question, is there a plan I should consider in TrainerRoad that will help me reach these goals? I'm not currently a member, but am considering. So what plans?
Well, yes, there is.
Yeah.
Since you asked, Trey.
We should probably get into kind of the reasoning behind it though, right, Chad?
Yeah. I have much to elaborate on.
Cool.
There are really 2 plans, and we often get the question in these very instances, which better suits what I'm after. There's a century plan, which kind of states it outright. That's pretty straightforward. And then the 40K TT plan, people ask, why can't I apply that to this? You absolutely can. With the century plan, it's toned down, or at least the emphasis is shifted a little bit. And it's still about improving your sustainable power, but I see the goal more as I want to ride strongly and I want to finish strongly. Whereas with the 40K TT, you want to improve your sustainable power, but the goal shifts more towards riding competitively. So I want to ride to the fullest extent of my potential at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of the main difference point. Yeah, Nate, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, what is it, Trey? Trey, when you join, you just put in your race date and say it's a Fondo, and then it will do it. It will build it all for you. And I think for where you're at, I think the Century plan would be great. It's got that sustain, some over-unders, so on the climbs, you're probably going to be less likely to get dropped, but you still have that longer endurance stuff to keep with the group all day long.
Yeah. And now that you're training with power, I mean, if you've got an FTP, right? So if you were to look at, and I'm veering optimistically here, I recognize that. This is an ambitious pacing pattern. But if you were to take your existing FTP and simply reduce your power, I would look for something in the 15 to 25% range. And I know we're talking about a 0.7 IF, which would be a 30% reduction. But because it's a Fondo and you're probably going to have breaks and you're probably going to have groups, I would aim just a little bit higher. It's ambitious, and this being your first one, maybe not the most cautious approach. So, take it with a grain of salt. But, in the case that, say you have a 250 watt threshold, you're looking at riding between 210, 200 watts. And anyone who has a 250 watt threshold, think of that. I mean, riding at 200 watts is a very sustainable amount of power for a long duration. This is uncharted waters. I recognize that. But go out and do some of your longer rides and take a peek at your wattage, and I'd be willing to bet. I mean, you made it happen for 50 miles. I'd be willing to bet you can extend that.
That's really good too.
It's like the ceiling, right? Like you're saying, Chad, like this is like a thing to reach for, right? Yeah.
Really, yeah. And you don't want to spend hardly any time above that. It's going to be very costly over the course of a day that long, I promise, especially with dismounts, remounts, to use a cyclocross term.
If you the higher you go to threshold or over, the more glycogen you're going to use too. And it's just hard to replace all that. When you're operating at that low percentage, you're burning more fat. And you can go a lot longer. So that's where Chad mentions, like, you get those spikes, they start to really wear on you. To that 200, like, so Kona qualifiers, I know, Trey, you're a little bit bigger than some of them, but they're doing 200, 210, I think we even heard 190 for an Ironman to qualify for Kona. So, like, kudos to you. That's legit, 200 watts for 50 miles. And if you can extend that, like Chad said, with some training, that's even more legit.
Super, yeah.
Yeah, and when we talk about extending it, you're trying to drag your normalized power, average power, and in a situation like this, you want those to closely match. You don't want big variability in what you're doing. To drag that up to your 100-mile normalized average power, this is about increasing stamina, what we talked about earlier. You have a particular power, you're just trying to make that power last longer, and that, again, is kind of what the Century plan aims at. But if you actually want to toe that FTP up a bit and then work at maybe even a lower percentage of a higher FTP or that same percentage of a higher FTP and go faster, then that's when the 40K TT plan is probably a better fit.
And the last thing I want to say is you don't have to go long to train for long. It's not a bad idea. Like it could even be better, but there's like sustained sweet spot workouts inside of Century Plan. And I showed it on Leadville. Like I didn't do any long rides. I still went sub 9 hours, like better than I ever have before too, which is, you always got to say relative to that person, how well did they do? Not saying I couldn't have gone faster if I did some maybe 5-hour rides outside, but I just didn't have the time, desire, or recoverability to do those. So for me, it probably was faster for me to do it this way.
It's also worth mentioning that chances are over the course of that century, you're going to have quite a few. I mean, Amber, like you mentioned, the full-on stops. And man, it's so tempting to spend too much time at those aid stations. But then the other side of things is you're going to get a lot of coasting moments as well within that. So if you've done something that has you doing like 2x30 at sweet spot, which if you do the century plan, you absolutely will do throughout the course of that plan, you'll get familiarized with 15, 20, 30-minute intervals like that. You're going to be really well prepared, relatively speaking, to a lot of folks, because you will be used to constantly pedaling at that sort of duration for 20 to 30 minutes. And in that race, I guarantee you that's probably not going to occur, or the Gran Fondo. It's probably not. You're going to have coasting moments in between then. So you'll be like, hey, this is easy. This isn't too bad at all.
Of all the things on the trainer, I think my favorite is that you never have to stop pedaling, because there's so much benefit physiologically to having to be able to, like, for 2 hours, not stopping once and doing these intervals that I feel like I can never, ever replicate on the road.
Yeah, and for extreme courses like Leadville, something like that, where Columbine's 2 hours, that's something for some folks. It's pretty rare that you get anything where you pedal consistently for 2 hours unless you're on the trainer.
But when you go out, and to your point, when you go out and race and you have these little micro rests, it's like, wow, this is so much easier.
Mm-hmm. It really is. So then it just becomes, going back to the same thing Chad said, then it comes down to making sure that you don't break that ceiling, because you might feel really good like you can do it, but trust in the numbers that by the end of the day, that's where you'll want to be, It's
a long day, race for it. And then kind of on the same note, in terms of bracing for it, do consider the fact that you're going to encounter a type of fatigue that you maybe haven't experienced before. This isn't to say you have to go ride 100 miles to experience this level of fatigue, but at 50 miles, you probably recognized it was setting in. So it's only going to escalate from there, but at no point is going to become unmanageable, I assure you. It just gets a little more, goes from niggling to nagging and becomes a little more prevalent. And what I'm talking about is obviously the working muscles, and I hesitate to use that term because all of your muscles are doing some level of work. So let's say the driving muscles, the legs that are actually turning the pedals, in addition to that, you're going to have tired postural muscles. And I mean, that goes everywhere. Obviously, we're talking like low back and upper back and spine and neck. Those will be, at the forefront or at the front of the line for sure. But also your feet, your hands, and your undercarriage, all those contact points, they're going to get a little more and more uncomfortable. But if you know that going in and don't let it come as a surprise, you can actually brace yourself for it so that it's not as big of a deal as it might have been if you hadn't considered the fact that this will at some point affect me.
And strength training is the best way to go about, especially those postural ones. It's absolutely, in my experience at least, the best way to go about managing that. It isn't just to ride long all the time. It's it's like a person that wants to get strong, just like, okay, go out and find heavy rocks and move them around, right? Like, no, like we follow structured training approaches for this, and strength training helps a ton for that.
Yeah.
Chad, what one exercise would you recommend for strengthening your body for long rides?
Body weight, you could just do planks. But if it's strength training where you have access to a barbell or even dumbbells or just something heavy, deadlifts.
Yeah, those have
push-ups
been
work quite well too.
The feedback that I hear from a lot of people that pick up just doing deadlifts and haven't done them before is my lower back pain isn't as bad anymore, or it's gone. Yeah. That's like what I very commonly hear.
Yep, and planks are great for that. And what's a push-up but a moving plank? So it's just a plank that's a bit more dynamic in nature. And then also consider that the fatigue is going to extend past your body. It's also going to affect your brain too. And we're talking both on a cognitive level, so how hard it is to form thoughts and your reaction times, et cetera, but also in terms of managing your RPE. So how hard it feels over the course of the miles 60 to 70, 70 to 80, 80 to 90 is just going to escalate upward and upward, most likely, at least to some degree. It will. So again, brace yourself for the fact that I know I'm going to be in a darker and darker place as this goes on. And it might not be that extreme. You might pace it and manage it and nourish it really well, but brace for the fact that it's a strong possibility.
Yeah. I think that, with this sort of effort or with these sort of rides, I've also noticed that if I go a long time without going back without having done a century, anything like that, a long day, it comes as a surprise if I don't prep myself in that regard. Like you said, Chad, it's just, I have to be ready for it. Right. And so this is something that even if you're not a new rider, it's important to remember that any sort of specificity that you do in your training absolutely pays off on a day like this. So yeah, absolutely there. Anything else that you guys would want to add for advice for somebody that's going to be doing a century like this?
Yeah, I actually tried to distill it down to 3 points. So everything we've set aside, RPE, or how you feel, is always a factor, and it's potentially the factor during events like this. I mean, pay attention to how you're feeling. The second part of advice, and it ties very closely to that, is don't let the power numbers goad you into overdoing it. You'll know when you start out, maybe mathematically, scientifically on paper, anecdotally based on the shorter rides I've done, and maybe there are things that tell you I should be able to do this. It depends how you feel. How you feel on the day trumps all of that. So pay close attention to it. And then long rides with some level of nutrition experimentation. So if you haven't done a long ride, and you've done 50, you've done 60 miles. So you know that over the course of it, if you're eating the same thing, you experience that palate fatigue we've talked about before. Those things aren't interesting to you anymore. So it becomes harder and harder to ingest them. When you hit the aid stations, there's a lot of potential missteps in terms of nutrition. Foods that maybe you haven't eaten in the past that suddenly you're going to introduce into your diet into this situation, which, if the intensity is low and you're out there just kind of enjoying your day, probably not a big deal. But if you're pushing it and you're giving yourself new types of nutrition, stuff you're unfamiliar with, just hitting the potato chips and whatever, you'll see all sorts of, quote, junk food out there, which in the moment, it's acceptable, but it might not agree with you in terms of your GI system. And then along those same lines is over the course of the day, the whole transition that you see with, Grand Tour riders doing long stages where they start with solid foods, and then as their maybe interest in the foods or their ability to digest them kind of dwindles, they shift to gels, and then they shift to liquids, that sort of thing.
Because the intensity should be low enough throughout that day that you could probably take down
whatever you want.
I want to add one thing to Chad's point, and I think he'll agree with me when he says RPE is always a factor, perhaps the factor. At the very beginning, don't let power meter be a governor rather than like up, because at the beginning, especially everyone's there, 2,000 people, everything feels easy.
Yeah.
And you go, whoa, my power meter's wrong. Like it's up by 100 watts. And then there's a middle part where you're like, you almost don't want to have the RP is king. And then at the very end of the race, I do use the power meter as like a stick. When there's 15 miles left, I'm like, I'm not letting it drop below 200 watts because I know I'm just going to suffer through this. That's kind of like how I go through a longer stuff.
Absolutely. The power meter is a useful tool the whole time. It's good to have that information, but don't let that information paint you into a corner.
If you start off at 200 watts and you're like, I feel horrible, but I think I can hold it, like stop holding 200 watts, like drop down.
It's not going to turn out well. Yeah, Nate, I do the same thing. I have that like inverse relationship, like right where like as the race goes on like that, suddenly the power meter is like it's my carrot, and it's like, come on, you can do this. I know you can do this. I know you can hold that number, and I have to remind myself that I can do it. It's a really helpful thing in that case for sure toward the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to Chad's point, I just want to bump one little point about the nutrition. Since you don't always know what's going to be available at the aid stations, you don't necessarily want to be relying 100% on the aid stations. Because if you get into the aid stations and it's something like, I don't know, wood-fired pizza or something, it might not be the thing that's going to fuel you really well or sit well on your stomach. So, plan to bring your own nutrition, and then you can supplement with what's at the aid stations, but make sure that you have what you need on the day, so that if what is at the aid stations is not something that's going to work for you, you're not, stuck in a food desert out there.
Do you guys ever carry like 2 pounds of gels with you, like for one of these races?
Yes.
Yeah. And it feels bad.
What's nice about it though is when you don't eat all of what you brought, you can be the person that saves other people out there, because there will definitely be people out there who are bonking and dying, and you can be their guardian angel on the day, like, hey, would you like a gel? And the next thing you know, you've just saved somebody's day. So make friends out there.
Cliff Bar is so smart at this. When they do the longer events where Cliff riders ride, they keep their pockets just stuffed with Cliff products, and then they look for people who are bonking. They're like, hey, try these chews. And then they have that experience, and they're like, oh my goodness, the wheels are back on the bus, and they can just go.
Yeah. And everyone may laugh at you at first for having those gels, but the very people laughing at you will be thanking you later on. So,
totally.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with being prepared.
Yep, exactly. We just need bigger pockets. That's all. If you like this video, you should subscribe to our channel. Maybe even give this video a like with a thumbs up and a comment down below.
If you want to see race analysis videos, you can click on it right over here. And if you want to get your coaching questions answered, you can click on it right over here.
And if you want to become a faster cyclist, which you should go over to TrainerRoad.com. It'll make you faster. We promise. We guarantee it, right, Nate?
Guaranteed. Or your money back.
Yes, it's true, actually. We really will do that.
Yeah.